Welcome to the Spring 2021 Indianapolis Community Garden Collaboration. Thank you for being here and being part of this conversation. Last year about this time, we hosted the Community Gardening During COVID webinar. Many of you joined us for that. We hope that it was helpful. Some housekeeping items. You might like to click the speaker view in the upper right-hand corner so that your Zoom displays just the presenter's video and the slides. You'll also want to mute your microphones. Feel free to put questions into the chat and we will monitor them. This will be recorded. Please type in the chat the name of the garden that you work with. I'd like to introduce tonight's facilitators. Brooke Outford is the Purdue Extension-Marion County Urban Ag Educator here at Indianapolis. She provides technical support and educational programs and workshops across the county for the benefit of urban growers. I am Linda Adams, and we are also joined by Corey Chatterton. She and I are both Purdue Extension-Marion County Community Wellness Coordinators. Our hope is to remove barriers and make it possible for limited resource people to improve their health through physical activity and proper nutrition. One example of how we might interact with a community garden is by surveying food pantry clients to identify preferred produce and using those results to inform the planting plan at a community or donation garden. Finally, I'd like to introduce Grace Coleman. Grace is an AmeriCorps Public Ally intern who is spending the better part of a year with us to help us examine the needs of Marion County community gardens. You might have met her via email or a site visit already. Brooke? You're on mute.
I know, I'm trying to get there. Thank you, Linda, and thank you all for being here tonight. It's great to get a good crowd here. The goal for this community garden collaboration is to better connect this community of growers, and doing so through networking, workshops, shared resources, and shared experience. Because I think all of that, by sharing all of this, we can lift a whole lot more sales of our community gardens. And for us here at Extension to better understand what type of programming is needed for community gardens. This is a space for community garden leaders, and we welcome all feedback on how to best utilize this collaboration for the betterment of this community. In the future, we intend to do this in person, so hopefully that's not too far around the corner. Our plan for tonight is to first have Dr. Ingwall's presentation, the natural pest control in the garden, followed by Q&A, and then we want to gather as a group to discuss various garden topics. We have a few polls for you to respond to as we hope to gather information about types of gardens, resources, challenges in the gardens, and then get more feedback and allow garden leaders to just share more about what they're doing, what their successes have been in the last year, their challenges, that sort of thing, so we can get to know each other better and start sharing. But first, we're excited to have Dr. Ingwall here tonight to join us to discuss natural pest management. Dr. Ingwall is an assistant professor in the Purdue University Department of Entomology. She works on pest management and specialty crops, translating research into practice for a variety of food crop production systems. Her expertise and interests lie in pest management in controlled environments and using natural enemies for biological control. During the presentation, as questions arise for you, please put them in the chat. Linda will monitor the chat and present all the questions at the end of the presentation. And at the end of those, if people want to turn on their mics and voice questions following the chat, that's going to be available also. All right, with all of that said, now I would like to turn this over to Dr. Ingwall. Laura, thank you for being here tonight, and thank you for being a resource to growers all over Indiana.
Thank you for the introduction, Brooke. Let me get this up. Okay, are we good? You see my title slide?
Yep.
Okay, great. I'm super excited to be here and to connect virtually and hopefully someday in person with many of you. Some of you I recognize on the participant list, and I'm sorry if you're hearing the same thing from me for like the 5th time, but, but I'm glad that you're here. So yeah, Brooke asked me to talk about sort of natural pest management, and so I interpreted that in really reviewing some of the key pillars and tools in an integrated pest management plan to help set you up for success this season, and then talk briefly about some specific examples and sort of where and when to apply those tools. And so I'm going to elaborate on my background first, but I'm working with the idea that you have a pretty good understanding of what IPM is. And so if that is not correct and you want me to clarify anything as I go, please interrupt. I have no problem with that. I'd rather make sure that you're following what I'm trying to say, I guess. So like Brooke mentioned, most of my experience in this field has come from the work that I've done in high tunnels. So when we talk about, when she mentioned controlled environments, what I'm really talking about here is hoop houses or high tunnel systems, specifically working with crops like tomatoes, cucumbers, and specialty melons. The majority of my research happens at our research farm, where I have access to 13 different tunnels at the moment that I share with colleagues to do this research. But I'm also really, really excited about the opportunities that I've had and future ones to partner with growers and do some of the work on farm as well. And so here's just a snapshot again of those crops and some of the pests that we encounter. So in tomato, the hornworm tends to be a big issue. And then here's a snapshot of what one of those specialty melons looks like. So as you can imagine with the crops I mentioned, cucumber beetles is one of the main insect pests, and that I've spent a lot of time working on how to best manage using organic practices, which basically in high tunnel production rely on exclusion principles and keeping them off the crop to begin with. I've also worked a lot though with a variety of mite species, aphids, evaluating and improving our detection and control, and a little bit with commercial bumblebees and using those as supplemental pollinators in various habitats. So in terms of biological controls, you know, we have a lot of them available commercially and naturally occurring in our crops. So some that I've worked with are lady beetles, lacewings, predatory mites, syrphid flies, and the minute pirate bug. So I'll talk a little bit more about what makes each of them unique and an effective predator to have in your garden. But the bottom line is my objectives for today are really to help prevent the situations that you see here. These are extreme crop losses due to insect infestations, oftentimes come from a lack of knowledge about what to expect or a lack of tools to effectively mitigate or prevent this from happening. And so what I'm going to draw on today are, as I mentioned, IPM principles and practices. And so IPM is really an approach that you take to managing any types of pests in your garden. So that can be insects, pathogens, or weeds themselves. And it's really using this ecological perspective of maintaining the entire community in which you're producing, identifying which individuals are of a true threat, and in terms of food production, that is, which ones are competing with you to eat the produce that you're harvesting, and which insects can be present and we can tolerate and aren't necessarily a threat. So we oftentimes call those our economic thresholds or action thresholds. And then drawing from these different tools that we have to help mitigate and manage pests. So broadly, those contain cultural controls, which I'm going to spend a lot of time talking about today. Because now is the time to really have those in place and be utilizing the power of cultural controls. Then we'll talk about mechanical, biological, and very lastly, some chemical control options that may be appropriate and accessible in community gardens. So some of the cultural controls that I want to talk about today have to do first with selecting the plant and when you put that plant in the environment. And there's a lot of power here in the hands of the grower in terms of the timing of when you plant things in relation to when pests occur in the environment and when they're biologically becoming active and looking for suitable host plants. So in the springtime, as we start to build up and are anxious to transplant in the field, insects are also coming out of hibernation and developing as they accumulate warm temperatures. And it's very predictable for a lot of species of insects. So we can calculate based on the temperature when an overwintering pupae of a seed corn maggot fly, for instance, is likely to emerge from the soil, and that adult is then looking for a suitable host. And so if you can delay your planting to occur after that peak emergence, you're creating a mismatch between the host crop and the pest, and therefore avoid the threat altogether. Another really powerful tool is seed selection, and so this can be at the level of the type of plant you're growing or the variety or specific cultivar. And so this can be done through consulting seed catalogs. And the important thing to know in this situation is what those potential pest threats are. If it's a pathogen that you're trying to manage, seed catalogs are a very, very good resource because they can tell you from the trials that they do in developing these different varieties what pathogens the plants are resistant to. And so you'll see this here in Johnny's. They have this table, this reference chart for all of the different codes. And then as you browse those particular crops, you want to locate that code, and online you can actually filter for the code. Other, seed catalogs have the same information. So Burpee has this table for tomato disease resistance and tells you here which ones have resistance to particular pathogens. So in this situation, it's really important to know what the threat is so that you can plan accordingly. And if you have something like, like verticillium, for instance, that appeared last year in your crop, it will likely be there again this year. So choosing a variety that can tolerate and help eliminate that disease in some cases is really helpful. You can also do this through seed saving and seed selection on your own, in your own farm or garden. So you'll notice that variation in damage occurs within a single crop even, and that variation can be related to some of the genetics of the plant. So if you're one who likes to save seeds, choose the most vigorous plant in your garden that withstood drought stresses or heat tolerance or aphid infestations the previous year, and save the seeds from that fruit. Those are going to be the best ones and the most adapted to the environment in which you're producing it. So you have some power over that to do some self-selection. Rotating crops, again, spatially, if possible, is a really valuable strategy if you have soil-borne pathogens or insects that reside in the soil, because you can just physically move them. Especially in a situation if you're using raised beds where there's actually a physical barrier from an insect traveling from one portion of the soil to the next. Sanitation and rotation can be very helpful. However, if you do have a situation where you have an outbreak of a particular pest or disease in particular, it may be necessary to sterilize your growing media. And so in a raised bed like this, it could be something like solarization, where you cover that with a black tarp and you allow the soil to get very, very, very hot, essentially cooking and killing any of the pests that may be residing in there. Or in some situations, the pathogen may even move into the wood of the bed and you may want to start over or avoid growing a particular crop that's susceptible in that bed permanently. And then the last thing that I want to briefly mention here is intercropping. This is something that I get a lot of questions about. In particular, what should I plant next to my tomatoes to keep hornworms away? I don't have specific recommendations because it's highly variable. It's variable on the variety and the situation. and the growing environment. So from a research standpoint, we can't reliably predict every time you plant pak choi next to broccoli, you're going to be pushing flea beetles away from that crop. It doesn't always work. And so broadly speaking, intercropping is very effective because you are diversifying the habitat. And so an insect that specializes on a particular plant is going to have a hard time finding that plant if it's in a forest of 20 other different kinds of plants, right? So intercropping works in that sense that you're interrupting the ability of the insect to find their host. Another way that it works is to promote the benefits of natural enemies that may be colonizing and suppressing pests. And so that is incorporated in this structural complexity that you see here. So we have some tall fruiting crops and some low growing nasturtium and ground cover crops. What this does is provide habitat for a variety of ground beetles, spiders, and parasitoids that can fly around. Some prefer this open upper canopy, some want to be in the dark all day. So diversifying that habitat provides more resources and more space for beneficial insects. And lastly, you're also diversifying the food sources. And as I go through some of the beneficial insects today, I'll talk about why that's important and what they are feeding on besides the pests that you're interested in. If you don't start your own seed and you purchase seed starts from a nursery or a greenhouse, a box store, you really want to make sure that you're buying something that's clean. Transplants that are pest-free will do much better. It will prevent initiating an infestation in your community garden. And it is all too often that when I go to the store and look at purchasing these starts, most of them are already infested with insects. And so the things that I would encourage you to look for in particular include aphids. Aphids are oftentimes on seedlings, especially as they get older and have been sitting at the store for a while. The other thing is thrips. And thrips damage is pretty identifiable. I don't have a picture of it today because I'm not going through the pests, but you can find pictures on our website. If you can familiarize yourself of what the symptoms look like from this type of insect feeding, then you have more knowledge and can pick healthier transplants to bring home and put in the garden. And so that leads me into this really educating yourself, become familiar with, and learn to recognize the most common or anticipated pests. And so if it's a new crop that you've never grown before and you can't rely on previous experience, there are a lot of tools available that may have been created for commercial growers or growers in a neighboring state. But as long as regionally you are within the vicinity, you can use those tools to at least know what to anticipate in your community garden. So things like these Purdue Plant Doctor apps that we have one for tomatoes, trees and shrubs, and I think one for fruit trees is coming out, but then the rest of this is mostly ornamental and landscape. But you can browse through those apps and look at pictures and see what is encountered specifically in Indiana and some recommendations. We have a website for extension entomology vegetables and extension entomology fruit, and we have photo galleries in both of those that will show you pictures of pests that you can anticipate encountering here. And if you're not sure, you can always visit the Plant and Pest Diagnostic Lab. And so you can submit digital photos or physical samples, and they will make sure that your specimen gets to the correct specialist, expert, and gets you an answer. And that usually costs around $11 per sample, depending on what the issue may be. I love that someone doodled on here. I don't know how that happened. And so getting back to that, identification is really important. Sometimes we need it at the species level, but a lot of times we just need to broadly know, is it a caterpillar? Is it an aphid? Is it a thrips? Is it a mite? A lot of the natural enemies and other management strategies that we have are effective against broad groups of insects. In some situations, we have tools that are species specific. If it's something like a pheromone lure, or another lure that smells like a particular species that we use for monitoring or trapping, then in that situation, the species is important. But there are just some broad characteristics of groups of insects that can really help improve your management strategies if you have the correct identification and then understand their biology. And so one that I wanted to mention and bring up is thrips in particular, because it's one that is fairly unique. Well, actually, I shouldn't say it's unique. There are a lot of insects that transition from one place to another as they develop throughout their life cycle. So you may find an egg in this particular habitat or on this particular plant. And then when the egg hatches and the new young starts feeding, it may move and feed on a different part of the plant. And then as it transitions to an adult, you may find it on a completely, again, not even a plant part, or moving from a vegetable to a tree in your yard. And so that's where identification can help, and it can help you uncover potential causes or sources for infestation. For instance, if it's something that overwinters on a tree, but then moves into a vegetable, you know to look at the trees on your property or the forest edge on your property to see if it's overwintering there. For thrips, which have a part of their life cycle in the soil, if you're managing the above ground portion that you see on the plant parts, but not doing anything to manage that soil dwelling portion, you will see potentially repeated infestations and wonder why your control isn't working when it could be effective at getting one portion of the life cycle, but leaving that underground free of any type of predation or suppression. Okay, so once you know what you're looking for and what to anticipate, you should develop a scouting protocol. And this could be a little bit tricky in a community garden where you have a lot of different people working, but scouting protocols can usually be pretty generic to start with, just to educate people about what they're for and the utility. And then if you have specific crops and you know what those pests are, you can hone it in. And so something like tomatoes that a lot of people tend to grow, it's a popular crop. Tomato hornworm is one of the biggest threats or pests that we encounter in that crop. And they are extremely good at camouflaging themselves and hiding. And so it takes a bit of a trained eye to be able to locate a younger hornworm. And I'll show you a picture of that later. But learning what their defoliation looks like or what their frass looks like and looking for the frass that falls to the ground and below where they're feeding is much easier than trying to disentangle this caterpillar that's hanging and mimicking a leaf or a stem of the plant. Aphids are another one. They're very small and discreet, and they oftentimes feed in protected areas of the plant. So what that means is on the undersides of leaves or in the whorl of a leaf that is just unfolding, because they're also hiding from predators and the people who are scouting and looking for them. So knowing that aphids are a potential problem on your crop, and then knowing that when you scout, what you actually need to be doing is flipping over the leaves and looking on the underside, or looking for their cast skins. Exuvia, we call it. It's like a white flaky thing that falls down from the underside when they molt and grow, are ways to improve the detection. And so this next picture here is just showing you the difference with the hornworms. And so these are on some sweet peppers, and what was an indication to me that I had an issue, first of all, were those little holes that you see on the underside of this leaf. What you also can sort of see in the picture is that there's this wilted leaf laying here. So it was actually cut from the main stem. And so I saw this wilted leaf hanging and then these holes, and I thought, oh, there's got to be something munching on here. And when you flip it over, sure enough, there's the big one. And those are easy to see, but look at what's right next to it. That's the same insect. It's just an earlier instar, we call it, or a younger caterpillar, much more camouflaged. But once you train your eye to recognize that, you can start to see them when they're that size. as compared to the really large ones. And so some tools to have on hand to help you with this identification and early detection are things like sticky cards, which can intercept insects as they're moving into your crop. And so just looking at a sticky card can tell you if something's moving between one habitat and the next. The other thing for really small insects are hand lenses. So a 10x or a 20x hand lens or a magnifying glass will do the same thing. And then a little more sophisticated tools, but still not very expensive. They're around $20 each. If you want to be able to take some good photos for diagnosing the issues and sending them to specialists, this is a macro lens that clips on a smartphone and works really well and is universal. And this is actually a microscope that just plugs into your smartphone or your tablet and has LED lights. Both of them are about $20 and really handy in the field to be able to get that resolution. Okay, so that's all of the cultural controls that I wanted to mention. And next, I'm going to move on to mechanical. And so this is where we get into some of these larger pests that are problematic and predictable every single year. So here in Indiana, if you grow particular crops, you can expect that these pests will show up. The tobacco hornworm, the squash vine borer, caterpillars on brassica crops like kale and cabbage and kohlrabi, and Japanese beetles. The best method, especially for community gardens or backyard farmers or organic growers even, is physical exclusion. And so this is something that has to be applied in a timely manner when the crops are first transplanted, or if you can predict when that insect is present on the landscape, putting those covers on during that time. So for instance, with cucumber beetles, which you're seeing the cucumbers protected here under the cloth, cucumber beetles have two predictable peak emergence for adults in the crop. One of them is in early June. And so if you cannot delay your planting and you want to get those plants into the field before early June, putting a cover over them like this, a mesh screen or a lightweight fabric, will keep that first population off of that crop. And then if they don't have any place to lay their eggs and have a second generation grow, you can take that cover off, open that crop to pollination, but you've avoided that first peak of damage. This is also really effective against a lot of the brassicas. So the caterpillars themselves are very, very small, but the adults are what is coming into the crop and laying eggs that then cause the harm when they hatch. So using exclusion cloth and netting is effective at keeping out all of these critters. Cucumber beetles, like I mentioned, can be effective, and flea beetles are another one that are really hard to manage. And this depends on the crop. If it's a fruiting vegetable like eggplant or tomato, flea beetles are a problem in the sense that growers don't like to see the leaves with holes in them, but they oftentimes aren't feeding on the fruit or the part of the plant that we're actually eating. So they're not necessarily competing with us, depending on when they infest that crop. Something like kale or leafy greens, where you're both sharing that leaf and eating that leaf together, in that situation, exclusion netting is a good tool to keep that leaf healthy and hole-free and looking delicious. Okay, next I'm going to go on to biological controls and review some of the most common natural enemies that you can promote, conserve, and maybe even enhance by adding to your garden. And so just briefly re-mentioning this idea of intercropping or diversification, I think that's one of the benefits of community gardens that you almost have built in, because each plot can be different. And so having that diverse habitat and food source is really beneficial. And that's because a lot of these natural enemies feed on pollen and nectar as a very important source of their diet. High in protein and leads to reproductive success and more of that. So having flowers present, whether that's a fruiting, flowering vegetable or something like sweet alyssum or gomphrena or buckwheat, those are really appealing to a lot of these predators that I'm going to mention today. And so the first one are lacewing, and I think that a lot of us are familiar with and can probably recognize adult lacewing. That's this green with the veined wings held vertically over the back. We also have brown lacewings that occur in Indiana. The larvae are who are actually doing the predation services for you. So they are generalist predators, meaning they will feed on a lot of different types of small, soft-bodied insects. They start out really, really small, hatching from this little white egg that's laid on a stalk on the plant. So a lot of times growers will ask me, or not even notice when they have these, but these little stalks with a white ball on the end are really important, and keeping those in the garden is great because they eventually grow into this voracious little alligator. The adults themselves don't actually do any of the biocontrol, but they are feeding on pollen and nectar. So if you don't have those resources around, the population will not persist. Lady beetles, again, are very common. There are larvae and adults both preying on the pests in your garden. So just recognizing what lady beetle eggs look like. They're elongated and yellow and often laid in clumps. Lady beetle larvae right here, and then they go through a pupation stage. So as the larvae get larger and larger, they get ready to turn into adults, and they do this sort of resting stage here where they create this like equivalent of a chrysalis for a caterpillar, this little hard casing. And if you look close enough, you can find that in the flowers and the vegetables in your garden, and then the adults will come out of that. The minute pirate bug is one of my favorites. In the fall, you'll see a lot of people talking about how annoying they are because they can bite, which is actually stabbing you with their straw-like mouth. But they are really abundant in Indiana. The adults and the nymphs are predators. Again, soft-bodied, small insects, as well as eggs and small caterpillars. But again, they feed on pollen, and so they're heavily attracted to flowers. The next one here are syrphid flies, and so these again are sometimes called hoverflies or sweat bees, although they are not bees. They're one of the first predators that you will see out right now. They're the main pollinator in strawberries that I have in my high tunnel right now, but their larvae are these little slug maggot looking things on a leaf. And just so for size, you know, this is a cucumber leaf, a vein, an aphid, and that's the larvae right here. And again, here's a different species, an aphid next to it. Very small, but very abundant. And so when you're scouting and looking for aphids, if you see these guys here, that's a good sign because they're helping to suppress that population. A little bit of a harder sell for people are spiders, but they're really good active predators. They'll go after, here you can see one eating a western corn rootworm beetle. They benefit from that habitat and being able to sort of disguise themselves and pounce out on prey or build webs to catch prey in. But again, they're really good, and they're oftentimes foraging at night. And then we have ground beetles. So ground beetles are really good at eating weed seeds, so they can help suppress weed populations in the soil, as well as eating other insect pests and mite pests. And again, they prefer ground cover and hide during the day, and they come out at night and actively forage at night. And then lastly here, just some other true bugs to become familiar with. And so these are closely related to things like aphids and plant hoppers, but they're predatory. And so this is a predatory stink bug, which I'll talk more about in the next slide. This is another predatory hemiptera that has a long beak. All of these actually have a long beak. This is the big-eyed bug and a stilt bug and a nabbed bug. And so they all have this long beak that they stab into prey. They oftentimes, I think, can be confused for plant feeders, and in some situations they may feed on the plant if there's not a lot of prey around, but in general they are really good predators. But again, they can sort of mimic or be confused with pests. So It's important to know your friends and your foes. And so this is a common example I like to use. On the left here is the brown marmorated stink bug. We have a lot of brown stink bugs in general in Indiana, which are pest species, but being able to recognize the spined soldier bug, the one beneficial, is really good because you want to keep this one in the garden. And the main distinguishing factor, you can't tell in this photo, but size is one. They're a little bit smaller than brown marmorated. They have these very distinct orange legs, and on the back of their wings right here, they always have this vertical black line. And if you're lucky, you'll catch them with a caterpillar in their mouth. And then one example of what we would call a specialist. And these are parasitoids. And we call them specialists because in general, they have a very narrow range of organisms that they feed and reproduce on. Aphid parasitoids are specialists usually on aphids. There are some species that they can or cannot parasitize depending, but kind of a broader specialist in that it's just aphids. But contrasting that with the tomato hornworms parasitoid Cotesia congregata, this little wasp only can survive on one particular caterpillar species. So what they always follow them around and find their way to your garden, but when you see an insect like this covered in these white cocoons, you want to leave it there because each one of those cocoons is a new natural enemy joining the fight. And the same thing when you see aphids like this. This was on okra at my house, and at first I got really freaked out looking at how many aphids there were, but when you get in there close, almost every single one of them has been parasitized by a wasp or is actually in the process of getting stung when I took this picture. So in this situation, the aphids were there, but the parasitoids came in quickly afterwards, and there was no need for me to intervene. And as a last resort, I'm sorry, I'm taking too long. We'll go through this quickly. As a last resort, you should turn to pesticides. And that is part of the organic model and the IPM model. And so most times in this situation, you're using organic pesticides. These are derived from plants or biological organisms, include things like BT, pyrethrum, neem products, and nematodes, funguses, and bacteria that attack the pest. The important thing to know here is that they are still chemicals. So regardless of the fact that they're organic, they are highly regulated. You need to read the label. Most of them require you wearing personal protective equipment, which is oftentimes gloves and long sleeves and long pants. There are limits to the number of times you can use them, and that's partially because of residues and the health of the consumer, and also because the pests themselves can develop resistance, even to organic or naturally derived compounds. These are some that are available at box stores, and so just the point here to highlight that some of these are pretty environmentally hazardous, that anyone can buy over the counter. And so really making an informed choice when it comes to regulating pesticide use in a community garden or actually applying it, having all of the information and choosing the correct product is important. And there are people like me here to help you make those decisions if you're not sure what to do. And so what you have to consider is from what you have available, what is the pest that you're going after, and is that on the label? If it's in an environment where people are going to be coming in and out with dogs and cats, or children are playing, what are the potential threats or dangers that may be encountered in that situation? And there's a span of what's available, so making sure that you pick the correct one is important. I'm going to skip this, but maybe I shouldn't. So here I'm just walking you through a pesticide label. And like I said, I am here to help with that. So making sure that you just follow all of the directions on there is really important, and really here looking at these restrictions of where you can apply it and the precautions. This is where you can potentially be hurting the plants themselves, is really important. And so just my general thoughts in terms of pesticide use. Again, the label is the law. And so what that means is you have to follow what it says on the label. And if the product does not have a label, you should not be using it. So things that are common, like using hot sauce or Dawn dish soap, are not recommended, and those are actually off-label applications, and there are consequences that can be related to that. So really, if you want to use a horticultural soap or oil, use one that has a registered label and has clear directions on how to apply it. Here are some resources, and very lastly, a plug. Please, 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 if you have not already, take our Urban Ag survey. It's closing soon. It's for any and all types of growers in urban environments, and it's really geared to help us better understand your needs and knowledge gaps and where we can work with partners to deliver programming and resources. So thank you.
Okay, we've got a question in the chat. Is there a good resource that lists life cycles of common pests in the garden?
So on the Purdue Extension entomology website, if you go to the vegetable program, and I can also send this link out to Brooke and Linda and others to share, we have a publication called Insects, Pests on Fruits and Vegetables, or Insects in the Garden. That is a really good resource that will introduce you to the common pests associated with common garden crops in Indiana. So things like tomato, potato, lettuce, melons. That's a good starting point.
Okay,
I'll put it in the chat.
Yeah, and Brooke has also put in the chat the website that she said where you can go to fill out that survey. And we don't have any more questions in chat, so if there's people that would like to unmute and ask a question, this would be the time to do that.
I have a question, Laura. At that entomology vegetable website, is there a good resource that just shows the a general schedule to be aware of in the season for natural pest control? I know we can go in like insect by insect, but has anybody yet created kind of a calendar?
No, we have not. And that is something that I would love to get more feedback on. I've thought about doing it based on the crop type, because I think that would be the most relevant maybe. And that's how we structure our fruit growing guide for commercial growers. It's like based on the development stage of the fruit tree or fruit cane, what you need to be looking for at that time. We do not have that resource right now.
Yeah, that would be great to have one of these days.
That's good to know. Here is.
I'm wondering if folks could maybe for a moment, just real quickly, put in the chat what some of your worst garden pests are that you battle in the vegetable garden. I know what mine are, but I'm not thinking what yours are.
I've heard from colleagues in other areas as well that squash vine borer is one.
Yep.
And oh, yep, it came up. So that's really interesting because out at our research farm and in rural growing areas, we do not encounter squash vine borer as often. But my collaborators in Ohio and in New York all say the same thing. Squash vine borer, particularly in urban environments, is really damaging.
Decimating, yes.
Well, I'm glad. Okay. We're going to test out, Brooke's going to help me. I have some squash vine borer traps we're going to test out this year that have a lure to help you identify that peak activity in June of when they're out and they're flying. And the best thing to do during that window is use exclusion. So if you can identify through these monitoring traps when the adults start to emerge and are flying and mating and get those plants covered, you only have to cover them for a 2-week window. Then that pest is done mating, hasn't found your crop, couldn't get to it, moves on and dies, and then you can take that cover off. So that's what I'm really hoping to evaluate and demonstrate this year. And if any of you have experience with that, let me know.
I think that would be particularly useful, Laura, because I've heard some growers being really concerned about for the summer squash, especially having it covered and not getting pollinated. So it sounds like you can actually uncover it in plenty of time when the blossoms come out. Hello. And it can still be pollinated. Is that correct?
Yeah, that's the advantage of having that monitoring tool paired with it. So you can know within your garden itself, when you start to accumulate adult moths in that trap, get it covered and then uncover it so that you're not, interrupting that pollination.
Okay. Yeah, that's going to be interesting to document. Sounds like a lot of problems with
Squash bugs too.
Yes.
Japanese beetles. I see that Tisha says here she planted in July and still got them. And so that's another thing that's going to be interesting. So they're pretty strong flyers. So depending on the landscape and your location, you could do a good job of preventing that first generation from laying eggs. But if you have a neighbor 3 blocks away or a quarter of a mile away that doesn't do a very good job, and you have that second generation come out, then if you continue to monitor, you'll be able to cover again. So you can leave that monitoring trap out and continue to empty it. And depending on people's willingness or interest in using pesticides, you can take that trap itself and put a pesticide in the trap. So you're not applying the chemical to the crop, but you're killing the insects that go in the trap. And so I think that there's some potential there to integrate that too, to help reduce that population.
So really keeping that trap up throughout the growing season is important, depending on generations. Okay.
Yep.
Somebody is asking what the best exclusion cover is. Do you have any favorites?
It really depends on the pest and the crop too, in terms of like if you're going to have issues with increased moisture. So a lot of times we use just a lightweight fabric that you can find from a few distributors. But if it's a situation where it's like pretty high heat and you need air movement, then you can actually transition to a screen material that has more holes opening in it. So yeah, Tammy, hornworms. For hornworms, you could use like a window screening material even, because the moths are very, very large. And so as long as your leaf isn't up against the material where they can drop that ovipositor, if you have a little bit of headspace there, that will keep them off. And actually, in the lab, when we rear them, that's what we do. We put a tomato plant in a cage and we cover it in a piece of mesh, and they lay the eggs all over the mesh. And then we take the eggs off the mesh and put them on food.
So Laura, I have to tell you something. Tyler Goff from Indy Urban Acres told us once when we were out there on a field trip. He says that you use bridal veil because it's the cheapest out there.
Yeah, like muslin, is that, you would also call that, like, is muslin different?
I think muslin is different. Bridal veil is from the fabric store, and it's that fabric you use for bridal veils. And it's similar but different, but he seemed to think that that was the most cost-effective material.
When we make our cages, we go to Joann's and buy the lightweight. Yeah, I guess bridal veil. I always thought it was called muslin too, but yeah, that is a really accessible way to get it too.
What Lena is saying.
Cool,
yeah,
that's it.
Yeah, that came up recently somewhere else in another conversation for something else. Yep.
Yeah, those work and they will last for years if you take care of them.
And the tool also is being recommended as a potential material for the cicadas on your young fruit trees.
Yes, well. It would do the same thing.
Yep.
Okay, well, thank you. Thanks for the suggestion too, Brooke, on that resource. That would be fun to put together.
Yeah, absolutely. Let's keep talking on that and let me know what kind of input you need. And I think that would be super helpful.
Hearing from the gardens and garden managers about the priorities of what the major pests are really helps us,
Yes.
you know, develop the tool where you need it most first and then go from there. Oh, so when are cicadas actually arriving?
Ah,
They started digging out of their holes at Martel in West Lafayette last week. So this freeze, we'll see if they were protected, but they are predicted. So the adults, they'll emerge from the ground in like a juvenile stage, and so you have a little time after they come out, but the adults is what you need to protect from, that will do all the singing and mating and damage on the trees, and that's around June, early June. And we have an interactive map somewhere.
we do.
I'll
Oh,
put that in the chat too, I think, that you can look at to see where within the state in particular you are and can expect them to come out.
And tomorrow night we're having a presentation just on cicadas here at Marion County Extension, and I can go look for the link on that.
Yeah.
Also, and there's just this great website that Purdue Extension's put together that is just everything cicada. You know, I think a lot of people are fearing them, but a lot of people are really excited about them, and they're fun activities you can do. And there's a wide spectrum of feelings about cicadas, it seems.
Yes, but we do have some citizen science activities, and I think, according to records, Indianapolis is predicted to be a hot spot. They were a big last year, or the last time 17 years ago that they were out. So we'll make sure that your educators, you guys all get that resource in case people want to participate.
Yeah, absolutely. I think I can send a link to the cicada website, and that has all of that information.
Yes, it does.
You did a great job with that.
Okay, thank you.
We have one more question coming in. Is there a way to keep squash blossoms clean from bugs, or a way to clean from bugs to eat them?
Because you like to eat the blossoms, I'm guessing.
Yes.
Yeah, without exclusion, again, is the best thing there, especially if you're just eating the blossom. They don't need to be pollinated, right? You eat them before that happens. So having some sort of netting or low row cover over them is the best way. They're just, especially summer squash, it's the first thing out, and those pests all are native and overwinter here. So the sort of cultural controls of avoidance and timing are not necessarily effective in that situation.
Okay. Good to know. Any final questions for Dr. Ingwell before we let her go?
Feel free to email me directly. I'm here to help all of you, so please reach out, or Brooke is really good at reaching out.
I definitely echo that we need to be thinking through it.
Thank you so much. Oh, I was just going to say thank you so much. I was trying to take notes, but I couldn't get them down fast enough. So I'll be waiting for you to send the recording, Brooke.
You got it. You got it. And, you know, let's always connect. You can connect with me or Laura directly as well. So I'll make sure everybody has her email also.
Thank you.
Good to see your face here tonight.
Thank you, everyone.
Good night, Laura.
So keep hanging on, everyone. We're going to move on into the next segment.
Yeah, so if folks want to turn their video back on now, since we are no longer going to have a presentation, we can see all those lovely faces. So now we want to turn to discussion for the group. Between all of us, we'd like for everybody to find out more about who is here at the table tonight and what's going on in your gardens. Corey's going to be posting some polls for us to start off the discussion. In the first poll, we'd like to know, what kind of community garden are you associated with? Corey, can you post that poll? The types that are going to be included are allotment gardens, which we consider those community gardens that have plots, often for fees, but not always. They are plots for individuals and family use. Donation, which might go to a food pantry, share a communal garden that is located in a community and is just grown for the growers and accessible to the surrounding neighbors as well. Often we have a hybrid where there's an allotment garden that also grows for donation. And perhaps you aren't yet in a community garden and you're just getting ready, so that's an option as well.
Oh.
And just so you know, Brooke, it looks like the first two questions were on there.
Actually, just grab number 2. Number 1 was the mistake that we did earlier today.
Okay.
Okay, we can go to the next question as well.
Yeah, let's just go ahead and have people answer on this just because about half of everyone's voted already.
Yeah, I think that's fine. That's fine. That's good. Yeah. So while you are putting yourself on the map with which type of community garden you have, we also want to know what your water source is, because there's so many different kinds, or well, there's a few different kinds. City water with the main line, city water with a fire hydrant, well water catchment with cisterns and rain barrels, or do you get your water from your neighbors? Or as some gardens experience, there is no access to water on site. We're going to give it just another minute here. Corey, it looks like they've stopped coming in. So if you want to go ahead and show the results on those first two questions, that'd be great.
Can you all see those?
Yep, we can.
Okay.
So it looks like there's a lot, well, there's a good diversity for one, but it looks like there's a lot of donation and hybrid. So there's a lot of donation going on in Indy these days, which is a really good thing. Looks like the majority of folks here tonight are getting city water from the main line. A little bit of well water, a little bit of catchment, the neighbors. See somebody who isn't getting water on site, and we know that that can be an issue. Looks like only one person is on the hydrant. That seems to have become a very, very expensive and less accessible option these days. Okay, and as far as which type of community garden do you have, Tammy says she's starting up a hybrid garden alongside their market garden. One has city water and the other has only rain barrels and cisterns. So a hybrid system there as well. Okay, so the next poll, we'd like to know what your biggest challenges are. So we've listed several challenges that we've heard from different community growers. And if you could pick your top 3 challenges, that would be helpful when it comes to thinking about what future programming we might bring to these meetings. And Taisha says, we have a market and youth garden currently, but hope to start a community garden as well. We don't have access to water, so transport, and I know that that's the case with some gardens as well. And it's a lot of work, I know. Okay, it looks like there are no more answers to the survey coming in. Oh, one more. We'll give it one more moment if you want to pick your top 3 challenges in the garden. And something that you might like to hear a future speaker address in one of our quarterly meetings here. Okay, Corey, I think we're good.
Okay.
Yep, so volunteers is the biggest challenge. It seems like having enough volunteers and to have them consistently throughout the growing season, all of the above can be really difficult. And then, you know, that's related to weed management, right? Getting enough hands on the garden. And then pest management is a high one also. It's so hard to nurture your crops, get them close to harvest, only to lose it to that dang squash vine borer who took out all of your zucchini or something else. Okay, Corey, you're gonna hang on to those, right?
Yep.
Thank you for doing that.
Mm-hmm.
Okay. So now I'd like to open it up for just more discussion, some open-ended questions for you. You might have seen them in an email come out today. First, and I think Corey's going to post these in the chat. Thanks, Corey.
Mm-hmm. Yep.
First, what were your biggest success and wins this past year? And you can post this in the chat or just feel free to unmute and share. We'd like to start off. It was a difficult year, but we'd like to really celebrate successes and wins. Successes and wins in the past year. I might have said challenges before, but I meant wins. I know you had some successes out there, people. Oh yeah, I remember, Roche, that you decided you needed to, yeah, you were too challenged with COVID. Oh, it looks like, Amelia, you guys installed raised beds to improve the soil. That's great. That's a big step forward. Taisha, getting funding to pay our youth. Congratulations. That is a big moment. Bruce at Bethany says producing with safety guidelines being followed. That was huge this year. To be able to continue producing and providing for your growers, for your neighborhoods during COVID, that was a huge challenge. And I was so impressed with so many growers that stepped up to the challenge to keep the produce coming. Lena, is it Lena or Lana? They doubled their produce this past year. That's amazing. Good for you.
Hey, Brooke, I got a direct message as well.
Okay.
Someone said that their garden started at least as much for the community as for the garden. We became closer and better connected as neighbors.
That's fabulous. Yeah, it was a place for people to come together this year because you could come together safely if you followed those guidelines that Bruce was talking about. Amelia said they got grants to support their plan, which sounds like included installing raised beds. So congratulations, Amelia. Esther, hi Esther. She says traveling and building raised beds for individual families. Good job, Esther. You guys stayed busy, I know. Tammy got a new family to volunteer despite the pandemic and produced without much effort. That's huge. I think we all know how huge that is, getting a family to volunteer and to get new volunteers during the pandemic. Yeah, it's good to hear that people did have so much success despite all the difficulties of this past year. Oh, and Amelia got the largest number of volunteer hours during the pandemic. Corey also building better engagement, more volunteers and more visibility. That's starting to sound like a common theme, that it actually allowed gardeners to come together even more around the project. Anybody else want to share as we get ready to move on to our next question? Oh, and Lena Lana also received a grant for a greenhouse. Congratulations. Good luck with a greenhouse. Tammy got a shed donated. Excellent. Esther has a question for Amelia. How did you get high volunteers? COVID evidently cut theirs down. So Amelia, are you able to perhaps unmute and elaborate on that? Or if not, just enter in the chat.
I will mute. I'll get myself.
Thank you.
Okay. Well, I can't get the video but yes, well, we have two types of volunteers. Our group is composed mostly of Purdue Extension Master Gardeners. So we have about 7 or 8. And last year, we had an incredible amount of hours. I think our educator says that Boone County ended up being, I think, number 9 in Indiana in terms of reported volunteer hours. But those were mostly from Master Gardeners. We still struggle to get volunteers from the community. We are trying to involve more and advertise. So we posted on our Facebook page. We posted, we published an article on Zionsville Current paper for talking about the garden and asking for volunteers. So we are using different channels and every opportunity and reaching out also to the MyBoard was helpful in connecting us with the Boone County Economic Council. We also have, and they had volunteers. We got volunteers from the Kiwanis Club, from Key Club, High School Key Club. And also we have one Master Gardener that contacted Girls and Boy Scouts, and to have those to have volunteers. So we had children, we had teenagers, we have although this is very still very, it fluctuates a lot. So we are starting to get more people involved, get their contact information and send out information about, well, we have a day of work like this Sunday, we'll be filling out our raised beds. So we send out information, we are reaching out to people to see who wants to come help volunteer. So in terms of volunteers from the community, we're still learning, we're still trying, but most of our steady volunteers are Master Gardeners. Hope this answers your question.
Great, thank you, Amelia. So you're in Boone County, and it sounds like the Boone County Master Gardeners, you have them pretty engaged.
Yes, we have, we are about 9 Master Gardeners, 8 or 9 Master Gardeners in the group that basically we run the garden, but we want to involve the community as well.
Okay, thank you for sharing, Amelia. That's great, congratulations.
You're welcome.
And one more success, Esther said that they got their tunnel from USDA grant. It's 72 by 22 foot high tunnel. Congratulations, Esther. I can't wait to see that. Okay, so we're going to go on to the next question. What tools and resources do you need to feel best supported as a gardener? What resources would best support your efforts in the community garden right now? You can type into the chat or just unmute. Everybody has everything they need.
No. There's me. Okay, I was trying to unmute.
Okay.
Our biggest need this year is getting rid of these pests that really attacked us last year. The cabbage moth and the, what are they, flea, what are they called?
Flea beetle.
Flea beetles, those two. I mean, we really are worried this year, so we're trying to really be ready. So those two things were so vicious. They attacked all our greens. Colors were just the favorite thing for the community, and we were battling with that.
Right, right. Yeah, on those cole crops, the flea beetle, that's where the damage really excels. You know, I think eggplants have the ability to make it through, and the fruit is successful, like I think Laura mentioned already, but on those cole crops, it's a big challenge. Well, Esther, let's keep talking. I really do want to work with Laura about providing more resources.
It's kind of was good for educational purpose though, because we used to teach students, you know, why all this crazy spraying keeps happening because of this. So we just need to work out, you know, to control them.
Right. Right. So it was an educational opportunity.
Yeah.
You are an optimist in that way, Esther. Thank you for sharing. Okay, Lisa Scott says, having the Purdue Extension email address will be a great resource for specific questions. Okay. Craig, session on getting fragile produce to food pantry without spoilage. Yeah, I can imagine that was a good learning experience. Tammy says funding and volunteers. They need funding and volunteers. I think that's a theme. Bruce is very specific. He needs a grant of $8,200 to install automatic drip irrigation. They need to tap into main water line to avoid spending $1,500 for sewage fee on water that was used for the garden. So you can get, Bruce, is it called, is it an agricultural rate, so that you're paying for watering the garden, but you're not paying for the sewage fee that we normally do at a residence or commercial site. So that's a big lift, Bruce. I know you'll get there though.
The challenge is the church is on a commercial account. We use the water from the church, and being a commercial account, you don't have the agricultural, or you don't have the seasonal use provision where the water company averages out or takes into account. Commercial accounts commercial accounts are at a real disadvantage with the way it's priced right now.
Right. Right. Well, thank you. Good luck. I hope you can tap into that main line soon and create an account just for the garden and save some of that money. Taisha says she needs more resources. She needs more funding and pest control. Pest control is another common theme tonight. I wish we had a network of experts for each plant, vegetable, strawberry, etc., to answer questions. So I think what we need to be doing at Purdue Extension in Marion County is sharing more of Purdue's resources online, because there are several, and we need to put together a good contact sheet. Linda, can you make a note for us on that one so that we can get more resources for different crops? Also get more to get water resources, Taisha says. And that's something that I think would be a good topic to discuss more. I know we're trying to look at ways to maybe get more cisterns out on community gardens. One of the big challenges At a lot of community gardens, as you know, you might get a cistern, but you might not have a building or any other impervious surface to draw that water from. So what are other ways to get that cistern filled? We worked with the We Care Community Garden on a pilot project this past season, whereby the local fire department was filling us up for it, and they were a great resource and we're willing to do it again this year. Corey Larson, being able to have the community in our community garden. Due to COVID, our garden has limited headcount and restrictions on visitors. This is at Corteva Agriscience. Our employee volunteers are excited to get back to working together in the garden. Yeah, I understand that. Chris Lawson says, sources for tools for Harrison Hill Elementary School in Lawrence. They have old tools that were hand-me-down, but they really need good tools for their mini raised bed gardens. They also need volunteers to help. So tools and volunteers. Corey wants you to know that the community coordinators are here to help as well. So we'll be sharing some our emails at the end of the meeting. Speaking of which, we should get to the next question probably. I think we're kind of
This one kind of touches upon stuff that we just talked about, I think.
yeah, I think it does too. I think we already answered that one. I don't know that we delineated those two as well.
Yeah. I could put it in the chat anyways, but I think it kind of just talked about.
So here was a question. What are your biggest concerns about volunteer management? What are your biggest maybe challenges with volunteer management? We hear that volunteers are sometimes they're just lacking in general. There just aren't enough volunteers. You don't have volunteers for the community that surrounds the garden, or maybe you have volunteers early on in the season, and by harvest time they're gone doing other things with their summer. Are there particular concerns with your volunteer resources that are hindering your success, or is it mostly just a lack of enough volunteers to do all of the garden work? Corey says volunteers don't always reflect surrounding community the garden is aiming to serve. Amelia says it's the lack of enough volunteers. So Grace, who was introduced earlier, the intern who's working with us this year, who's assessing needs of community gardens, is also trying to identify different avenues for directing more volunteers to community gardens. And so she's finding different sites where we might be able to list gardens. We're also trying to update the Marion County Urban Ag Map. It's moved to the Indy Food Council has a new website, and it's being called the Community Food Map because we're going to be adding farmers markets and local grocers to that map. And as we start updating that map again, that's the place where you can advertise your garden, the mission of your garden, and the needs of your garden. So that's a place to advertise for volunteers also, so that people can go to that map, look up their neighborhood, look for gardens in their neighborhood, gardens that appeal to them. So we're trying to find different tools to engage more volunteers in the gardens. Volunteers that are too enthusiastic and harvest produce that isn't ready, Alicia says, is a problem. Yeah, that can be a problem. That's that educational component. I've heard that I hear that often volunteers they really want to get education out of their time, and they want to be learning from their time in the garden. So really working on those volunteers about, what is the correct harvest period? What is the harvest condition of the produce before it's ready to be harvested? Bruce says, we have fantastic volunteers. We have systems of team leaders who take responsibility of specific crops and specific beds. Also helps to have the volunteer time be the same every week. So those are some tips that Bethany has had a lot of volunteer success out there. So having several team leaders has really helped the organization out there. And each leader has the opportunity to engage more volunteers. So Grace has put her email in the chat. If you are offering volunteer hours this year and interested in having your garden advertised, specifically working with communities, shoot her an email. So again, Grace's email is in the chat. And so if you want to be listed with universities to draw students or faculty potentially, let her know. Linda entered the link for the Indy Food Council website. Yes, Tammy, you're talking about Canva and Sign Up Genius are good for volunteer management alongside your social media. And I think the folks from Bethany would also say the same thing about Sign Up Genius. Oh, I see Linda shaking her head. Yeah, okay, good. Linda also put the link specifically for the Indy Food Council community food map in the chat if you want to go visit that as well. If you're not on the map, we need to update the current survey that's on there. But if you're not on the map, really think about getting on that map as we try and make that just a much more useful tool. All right, anything else? We're gonna close out here soon. Those are questions that we had for you and thought that you might have things you might want to share with each other. We are going to be planning these meetings now more regularly on a quarterly basis. And we do want to hear about who you might like to, what topics you'd be interested in hearing from speakers on. Compost has come up a lot, so we might do compost at the next session or two. Okay, so we're gonna wrap up now. I hope this time has been beneficial for everybody here as a garden leader or as a grower. And if you have any thoughts or questions, comments that you'd like to follow up on later, please feel free to email me. Corey, can you put my email in the chat? And then Linda and Corey, if you could put your emails in the chat as well. They are good resources on the community wellness side as well. You know, when it comes to things like delivery of produce to food pantries and that sort of thing. Okay, so to stay up to date on the program offerings here at Marion County Extension, you can follow us on Facebook and Instagram. Corey can put that in the chat. To stay in touch with other growers, to ask questions, to share resources and events, join the Indy Growers Network Facebook discussion group. So this is a discussion group specifically for growers in Indianapolis. And we really want to start steering to build this stronger network, steering more growers to that discussion group to share resources and experience and opportunities and events and that sort of thing. So we'll be sharing this recording via email. If you think it might be helpful, go ahead and share it with somebody you think it might be helpful too. One other resource, and you probably don't have this ready to go, Corey, but for a lot of the resources that growers need, if you go to the Marion County Soil and Water Conservation District website, you're going to find a lot of great information about soil health, planting native for natives and beneficials. So to really get that population of those beneficial insects, those predators and such in the garden, those native plant communities are what you really want to be getting out there. So Kevin just put some information there in the chat. Kevin Allison is the soil specialist who has produced all of those fabulous resources at that website. So I also really recommend that for resources as well. Any last questions before we close out? Okay, you have our contact information. Follow up with anything that might come to mind. Our next meeting is going to be in July, hopefully in person. We'll see how it goes. We'll definitely be in touch. So thank you all for being here, for taking the time out of your evening to be part of this collaboration. And thank you all for growing here in Indy and for Indy. We know it's a lot of work, but we hope it also just brings a lot of nourishment in several different ways as well. All right, thank you for being here. You have our contact information. We'll be sending out a follow-up email, and then we'll start planning for July soon as well.